Hi everyone, and welcome to AUSA's first sustainability Q&A session. Thank you for joining. Um, so we will have a little overview for now on what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, introduce myself. We will then talk about some zero waste myths, and we will then go into hacks to reduce your waste. And at the end, I will give you a couple of tips how to save money through DIY. And if you have any questions during the chat, then please just put them straight into the comments. They will come through to me, and I will try to answer them straight away. Or if not, I will answer them after the session if I have to look something up. My name is Stefan, and I'm the sustainability coordinator at AUSA. I've been at AUSA now for 1 year. I sort of prepare a little bit for the return to the office and getting AUSA to become net zero. I also work with Aberdeen Union on the net zero strategy for 2040 and quite a few other campaigns. Let's start with our zero waste myth. So one thing that lots of people sort of associate with zero waste is this, I should go plastic free. And obviously plastic is a very big issue. There are lots of documentaries, lots of information on how plastics impact the oceans, how it impacts marine life. And it's definitely a very good idea to reduce plastic consumption and cut it back. But there are definitely a few things to consider about the use of plastic. It's not just about getting rid of all plastic, I would think. For example, there are quite a few papers that suggest that getting rid completely of plastic could actually also be counter-beneficial and harm the environment more than it would actually help. There's one thing, for example, that if you would switch immediately from plastic bottles to glass bottles, glass bottles would need to reused about 20 times before, in terms of energy, it actually makes sense to use glass instead of plastic. So the carbon footprint of glass, for example, is higher in terms of production. The main thing, I suppose, with plastic is to really get rid of single-use plastics. So these are all kind of film plastics, packaging plastics, because those cannot be recycled, and usually those are the ones that then swim as plastic films into the ocean and are very harmful for the environment. But there are some plastics, plastic bottles, for example, that can be very easily recycled, and even better, can be reused by yourself. You don't need to use it once and then throw it away, basically. So very related to the go plastic free is biorecyclable and biodegradable. This is our second myth. I should aim to buy things in recyclable and biodegradable packaging. You see, for example, there is on the slide, you see this 100% biodegradable sign. And the problem with this is that there is a lot of greenwashing involved. For example, biodegradable does not necessarily mean anything. It is not standard. So biodegradable, everything biodegrades sooner or later. There are, for example, other packagings that say compostable. Now, compostable is different because that means that the material actually need to disintegrate within 12 weeks. So if you read biodegradable, that does not necessarily mean anything. And it's similar with recyclable. Recyclable really much depends on where you live. So every different council area in the UK, for example, can recycle different things. Some of them are widely recycled, others are not. But for example, as we spoke with plastic, you will find on plastic sort of numbers between 1 and 7, and all of them have the recycle sign on it. Now, No.1 and No.2 is widely recycled in the UK, so those plastics will become usually plastics again. So those are plastic bottles for drinks or plastic bottles for milk. But then most other plastics, for example, are not widely recycled in the UK, and therefore those are not 100% ideal either. So even if it says recyclable, that does not necessarily mean that it will actually be recycled. So yes, the next thing, sort of myth is that's connected with recycling is I recycle, so I'm fine. Recycling is definitely the thing you should be doing with all the waste that is recyclable. Unfortunately, there is a lot of waste that you put rightly in the recycling bin, but does not necessarily get recycled. For example, there is cardboard and paper is widely recycled in the UK. But the problem is that if cardboard gets contaminated, for example, and there is grease on it, there is water on it, it gets soaked. It cannot always be recycled back into cardboard. So very often then it actually gets downcycled. It becomes, let's say, tissue or like sort of soft paper. And this one then can't be recycled anymore. And at some point it will end up, well, in general waste. And this is sort of what we would try to avoid. The other thing is it's still recycling takes a lot of energy as well. So therefore, it's still better to avoid producing the waste in the first place than recycling it and potentially downcycling it actually. Recycling, however, is very important. One example is with aluminum cans, so your drink cans. Producing one new one, for example, consumes as much energy as recycling 20. So where it's possible, recycling is obviously great, but reducing your actual waste production would be even more important. And as I said, with aluminium, 75% of all aluminium produced so far globally is still in productive use. So certain things are very easy and widely recycled, while others not so much, unfortunately. Our next one is that one hears very often is, yeah, zero waste won't make a difference, so there's no point. I suppose that's with many things like that, people think if I'm the only one who's doing it, it will not have a very big impact. Well, there's sort of this one thing I read somewhere, if 8 billion people say, oh, it's only one plastic straw, that's a lot of plastic straws. So it does make a difference. And there is sort of this trend that in the UK, actually, the average person starts to producing less and less waste. So in 2010, it was still over 400 kilograms. And now it's under 400 kilograms. So yeah, if everyone is trying to reduce a little bit, then it will make an impact. Obviously, we can't stop producing anyways, because we will always have a little bit, but the idea is to produce less. Right, so those are a few common myths. There are obviously many more. But yeah, our next one will be a couple of hacks to reduce your waste. Yeah, hacks. Our first hack is consumerism for zero waste's sake. So what do I mean by that? There is sort of a industry that sprung up with the zero waste movement, providing loads and loads of different things that will help or presumably help people to produce less waste by buying more things. I read, sort of when looking it up, the zero waste packaging market is about $1.4 billion US at the moment, and it's growing. And I think it's the wrong way to go to say, buy everything new. So I buy my stainless steel food tops, I buy my reusable bottles and so on, and bamboo toothbrushes. But at the same time, I'm still producing that waste from all those things. So, for example, that would be much better if you have things at home that you don't use anymore, or just repurpose them, rather than buying new glass jars, new bottles, new food tubs. Even if it's, let's say it's old and you have plastic bottles at home, they can easily be reused, and it doesn't take the energy to produce new things to be zero waste. Then our next one is sort of fast everything, I called it. There's a picture of fashion and sort of a fast food chain sign. It's basically everything that is fast food, fast fashion. It tends to be cheap, which makes it obviously appealing for loads of people. You can change your whole wardrobe for not much money 5 times a year if you want to. The problem is that it has a massive impact on the environment and also on the countries where those things are being produced. For example, fast fashion in 2018 produced about 2.1 billion tons of CO2 emissions equivalent, which is 4% of the total carbon emissions. Now, that is older fashion, not just fast fashion, but fast fashion obviously plays a big part because it changes very quickly, and people buy more things, and they end up ultimately in general waste, worst case scenario in landfill. So I just saw one stat. It was 94 million kilograms of waste were from single-use outfits. So outfits that people wore once and then basically threw them away. So although it's not necessarily cheaper, but in this case there are responsible retailers where you can also buy new things that last you longer, or you will have a longer warranty on it, for example. And obviously second-hand shops, charity shops, and bringing your own old clothes to charity shops. That would be the ideal situation, where possible, obviously. And one other thing about fast fashion was that 20% of global wastewater production comes from fashion, which, if you think about it, it's one industry that produces a lot of wastewater, waste, and also carbon emissions. So try to stay away from fast fashion, fast food. Our next thing is get creative. Now, unfortunately, I'm not the most creative person, but I think with get creative, I said already quite a couple of things. Use the things that you have rather than buying new things. Try to repurpose where possible. Try to, if you know, for example, that if you buy a new reusable coffee cup, or a bottle, you know that you will lose it in a couple of weeks, then it's actually better probably if you use a plastic bottle more often. And don't throw it away, just reuse it. The energy that goes into producing new things tends to always be higher than if you just reuse things that are produced for a different purpose, for example. Our next one is plan ahead. Sorry, 1 second. Plan ahead. So think about what you will need, for example, with food over the next week. The more you sort of know what you're doing when you go shopping, the more consciously you shop, and the more you have things planned out, the less likely you get to buy things that you don't actually need, buy food that you eventually won't eat. The same goes if you have to, for example, order things online. Think about not just the one thing that just popped in your head. Think if there are other things that you need, and maybe you can have sort of one bigger order than buying over like every day over a week or so, because ultimately it adds up to packaging waste. That's the thing we want to try to avoid. And another thing here is see the bigger picture. That sort of sums up the things I mentioned before. So it's not always all bad in terms of what people try to avoid. So not all plastics are necessarily evil. There are things that you can do with plastics that you can reuse. You don't need to always buy new things that are sort of sustainable, that are compostable, that are biodegradable. Look at those things and see if they're actually what they're stating to. Is there a lot of greenwashing involved? Are there things that you have at home that you can reuse instead of buying new things? So try to see the bigger picture and focus on the things where you think that you can actually have an impact, which is packaging, which is waste production, food waste production, sorry. And the last one of the hacks to reduce your waste, that's probably the most difficult one, because it's everywhere. Immunity to advertisements. Yeah, so you have advertisements everywhere. And as I mentioned, also in the zero waste movement, you get lots of advertisements about new bottles, bamboo toothbrushes, reusable stainless steel cups and mugs and everything. Now, I think that's where sort of the issue stems from, that you don't need to buy everything new in order to go zero waste, as I mentioned before. The idea is that you reuse the things you have. So glass jars, for example, that's something that can be reused for years and years and years. So yeah, try to be immune. I know that's the hardest part, but try to sort of be immune towards advertisement. Yeah, and then we are already at our next part, which is save money through DIY. So this is actually not only DIY, but it's also about reusing and generally saving money. So packaged versus unpackaged. So, or what packaging? There is, unfortunately, with everything, loads of packaging involved. I remember sort of when I moved to the UK the first time and I saw cucumbers being wrapped in plastic, I was quite amazed about that. So there is always a lot of packaging. Obviously, the ideal situation, again, is try to find the same produce that you want without packaging. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. Now, as I mentioned before, try to stay away from single-use products or packaging as well. So if you find packaging that you can actually reuse, with, as I mentioned, being creative, so cardboard, for example, can be reused for various things, cardboard boxes or glass jars, things like that. So if you, or even tops from takeaways, if you get that kind of waste, that doesn't necessarily need to be thrown out, so you get other uses out of it, and therefore you avoid buying other things. So therefore you can actually save money through just reusing packaging that you get. So the one thing is, maybe when you buy stuff, then see that can you reuse the packaging as well. Don't just look at the product, look what comes with it, maybe. Yeah, and then our next one is very closely related to the packaging part. Reuse, can you reuse it? Is it reusable? Can you repair it? Can you upcycle it? Second-hand products. So those are all very related. So whatever you have already, obviously, if you can, try to reuse it, try to repair it, try to upcycle it. The same goes to if you go to second-hand shops or charity shops. You will see there are things that that you can use for not necessarily its intended purpose. And that will then, in many cases, can save you money and obviously gives you something to do as well. I'm not very good with repairing, but yeah, I'm trying to get there and reuse things more often. And then our next one, yeah, yellow labels. That's probably the best thing to do going shopping in UK supermarkets, is when you see those yellow labels. That's things that will go out of date soon and therefore are not allowed to be sold anymore, and therefore will ultimately end up in many cases in food waste. So buy those, save it sort of from food waste, and yeah, they're still good quality and probably last a couple of days longer anyway. So yeah, look for yellow labels. Usually you will work out in your local supermarket when is the best time to get the most yellow labels. So have a look at different times until you sort of worked it out. And our next one, sorry, solids versus liquids. What I was thinking about here is sort of all sort of soaps, even dishwash bars. So you can find loads and loads of replacements for liquid soaps, for liquid shampoos, for liquid dishwashing liquid. And usually they last you much longer. And therefore they're ultimately cheaper. They might not be directly cheaper, but the amount of uses you get out of them, it will definitely be cheaper than buying liquids. And you avoid all the plastic packaging. You can also obviously make them yourselves. There are loads of instructions on the internet on how to make soaps yourself, how to make dishwashing liquid and things like that yourself. And I think we have one more under this one. Yes, modular devices. That is probably less DIY unless you're really good with building things. But it is still it's still sort of starting. You don't get everything as a modular device, but it is definitely a growing part of the industry. So, for example, mobile phones. There are one or two that I know of companies that produce completely modular phones, so where you can basically change every single part of the phone without having to buy a complete new phone. So it is a good idea to look at those Fairphones, for example. There's also now this year, I think, is the first modular laptop that comes out. Again, obviously, if you can repair your old one and upgrade it, that's the ideal situation. But yeah, at some point, unfortunately, we have to buy new things. But those modular devices definitely will last you longer because you can replace only the things that are actually broken rather than getting rid of the whole device. And yeah, that was pretty much our first sustainability Q&A. Are there any questions? Okay, so yeah, thank you for joining AUSA's first sustainability Q&A. Have a look on our social media for the next one. And if you have any questions, then please just put them in the comments. I will have a look and answer them there. Or you can also email me at stefan.ginger@abdn.ac.uk and I will get back to you. Thanks for joining.